Hello friends, today we are going to talk about labeling, and I'm not talking about the labeling where you call people names. I'm talking about product labeling. We have all come to expect proper labeling on things as simple as a book or medication or just any food item that we pick up. And that labeling is quite useful. It helps you understand not only what it is, where it came from, but also what is contained in it. And if you are not expecting certain items, you will know whether or not that product is good for you. The same is true for business intelligence reports and dashboards. We need proper labeling around those reports and dashboards for a better experience for end users. I want to just briefly touch on four key benefits of labeling, or I might call it product documentation. When it comes to report, I'm going to label them with letters C, so consider them the vitamin C of business intelligence. The first is context. Context is key. Without context, you don't really know what the report is doing, what was it for, and all of those things. And later on, we are going to talk about some of the elements that help build that context. But putting that context in place unifies the perspective that end users or even developers will have about a report. The second thing is that once that is established, there is a common language, there is collaboration. That's the second C. Collaboration around not just the report, but any conversation around it. Too often, we have poorly documented reports that become a sore point in business meetings where numbers are presented and interpreted differently, and potentially disagreements ensue about, okay, what did these numbers really mean? And all of that can be cleared up if you had the proper documentation. So proper documentation will foster collaboration. The third C is clarity. You see, if you want to make a decision, you want to be confident about the data points that led to that decision making. And you may see that data point not on an isolated island, but in the context of other business elements. And proper documentation builds that case. It builds the understanding and the clarity needed around the content of the report so that we know, for instance, what was the analytical method or the assumptions, the filters that went into that report. That way, we can make a decision very quickly and clearly. The fourth C is consistency. You see, a lot of organizations have hundreds, even thousands of reports. Imagine if there was a different way of documenting each one of those reports. Sometimes maybe it's just a title and a couple of lines of description. Sometimes you will clarify the purpose and so on. If it's all over the place, there is a little bit of chaos and confusion ensues. So we want a very consistent way of documenting business intelligence content. That consistency builds trust, and it helps, just like when we pick up medication, I mentioned that earlier, we expect to know not only the name of the medication, but the dosage and how frequently to take it and what are the ingredients in it. So there is a number of elements that we want to include in our reporting documentation that will build consistency across the board so that our users, when they see something produced by the reporting team or anyone producing reports, will be familiar with what they are looking at and know exactly what to use it for. So those are the four C's that are going to be the benefits of proper reporting documentation. For this consistency to really pay off, you have to think about what are those critical elements that we have to capture all the time. The obvious ones are the title of the report and a brief description. So I'm not going to dwell on those. But there are 7 other elements that we want to make sure are always contained. The first one is a purpose. What's the purpose of this report? What are the business questions that are answered by this report. And what is it used for? What was the business need that led to even the request in the first place for this report? Related to that is the second item. Those business questions do not exist in a vacuum. There is a business audience that is concerned about those questions. Those questions are only relevant to that audience. So being clear about who the audience is not only will help someone who runs, who happens to see this report to know exactly what it does, but it also can inform the developer that this audience really needs details or just a summary or the ability to analyze. So it helps also with the design of the report or the dashboard itself. Now, drilling down a little bit into what went into the report, we need to talk about where did the data come from? What are the data sources for this report? On this front, there are two facets. There are two sides of this. You want to document something in a business-friendly language so that the regular business user can say, oh, this report uses data from our EMR system or our ERP system and so on and so forth. Or the second facet, you need to also document for a technical audience who might be called to troubleshoot this report or modify it at some point so that they know what is the actual database name, what are the tables involved, and so on and so forth. So both of those speak about the source of the data. But how about how that data was processed? That takes us to our fourth element. What is the analytical method? What are the assumptions and implicit filters that were used to create this report? We need to be clear about that in the documentation. This is often the kind of questions that a reporting team that is already very busy gets bombarded with because they get interrupted with questions such as, what does this report actually do? How does it do it? What's the logic behind it? Well, might as well just take time to document that logic upfront and explain to people exactly how it was built without getting into too many nitty-gritty details, but just enough to understand the process that went behind the report build in the first place. Now, with that, there is also the recognition that business needs change. There are always going to be reasons to modify that logical construct. That takes us to our fifth item. Proper documentation have to keep track of the critical changes made against the report. And this needs to be done in a dated chronological way so that you know when that change was made. This will help, for instance, understand a comparison to a prior instance of the report where the numbers were not exactly the same. So we may understand, oh, something changed in the build, in the structure of this report. The same way, we need to capture versions, because if there are critical changes that are made, we want the report to somehow indicate that to the end user. And it's good to have some kind of versioning. And I'm not talking about version control for programmers or developers, but for the end user, it is good in a subtle way to mark maybe in the footnote of the report. It doesn't have to be the most visible thing, but some indication of that this is version 3.0 of this report. That way, if there is a conversation about changes at some point and there is a comparison, you can say, well, this version was 3.0, this other one was 1.0. And you can then reconcile the differences. That takes us then to the question of how do we give access to this report? And this is where two additional elements are critical. The first is contact information for who to contact when you need access. It is also good to capture who is the owner of the report. Who was that requester that asked for the report, and better yet, not just their name, but their role, because people may evolve to different roles. So it's not so much the name, but the role, the function that matters here. In the same way, who was the developer or the team where the developer was coming from? Because multiple teams can contribute to reports for the organization. It's good to know whether or not this report came from the central business intelligence team or from the quality team or from other teams. That way you can trace back to the proper development source. With that, the last element, the seventh element, is how do I ask for access for this report? And here, a simple link to a request form suffices. But in that context, it's also good to remind people who the report was for. That way you have some kind of self-check to say, okay, this is relevant to me, and this is not a far-fetched request. And maybe with the request form, someone can provide additional information to confirm that, yes, they qualify as a recipient for this report. There you have it. We have gone through 4 benefits, the 4 C's of why proper documentation is so powerful and needed for business intelligence reports and dashboards. We have talked about 7 critical items that are needed when documenting those reports to ensure consistency. I hope that you can leverage these simple elements for a more powerful delivery of reports. Thank you.